boys' sex hormones skyrocket by 600% when they enter puberty, and their prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the executive command and control center of our brains, goes fairly offline during the teenage years because of the highly experimental, highly exploratory, very neuroplastic time in life. And so there's a lot of exploring going on with high levels of arousal. It's not a very uncommon experience. And yet you're right, it does hold a lot of shame because culturally, the one thing we're raised to be as men growing up is never be gay, to be aroused in the presence of another man, to get an erection with him, to ejaculate, to have an orgasm. That's something I don't want anybody to know about. And yet it's so common.
I am here today with Chris Inman and Scott Cone. I was just on your guys' live and podcast last week, so it hasn't been long since I've seen you folks. The We've Got Balls podcast, and then also if you guys want to find them on the web to find out a little bit more about what they do with clients, it's successfulmen.com. I'll start with you, Chris, and we'll pop over to Scott. What was the story of how in the hell you got into this in the first place, and then why a podcast and why a coaching platform?
Yeah, thanks, man. Glad to be with you. My story is as long as you want to go back. I mean, I was definitely raised in an environment where shame was a big part of my story. I was raised in the church. Maybe a lot of your clients have had that experience. Maybe they haven't. I'm the fourth generation Baptist pastor. So if you got any of those church guys, we can talk shop all day long.
Oh yeah, I think like 70% of my clients were Mormon at some point in time.
Yeah, so we can talk religion. In fact, I just was hanging out with a guy that teaches at BYU a few months ago. He came down for a retreat and got to just chew it up, and it was a great conversation. But yeah, so in that environment where behavior is everything, like I was raised to be a good kid, a nice guy, to behave myself. I'm an oldest child, and so when I started growing up, I had two parents who were pretty distant, and you're going to hear that a lot kind of in our explanation. We tell a lot of our stories because we feel like the context in which we learn to medicate with sexuality, compulsive sexual behavior, Scott likes to call it survival strategies. I like that line, was in that environment of things are very hard and very structured and very rigid, a lot of do's and don'ts, but there's not a lot of emotional connections. That's kind of how I grew up. Mom and dad. Dad was a pastor, always gone all the time. Mom was a homemaker, but she was pretty spaced out because she didn't have a lot of skills to be a mother from her own wounding as a child. So I had to figure it out. So I spent a lot of time doing the best I could, trying to be friendly, going to school, and of course, ran into pornography. And I'm a late bloomer. Porn for me was like something I found in middle school on my own. I wasn't exposed to it, wasn't sexually abused. But when I got to high school, man, I couldn't get enough of consuming pornography. And that kind of became my secret struggle. I didn't tell anybody about it. I thought I could just manage it on my own, and went for about 20 years of my life.
Chris, did you know, because of the faith or, some guidance from your parents at that point in time, were you harboring a lot of shame and guilt around that?
Yes, all the time, dude. I mean, I went to these True Love Weights trainings, and, pornography was a sin, masturbation was a sin, all those things that were there. So I absolutely.
And you subscribed to that.
And I was teaching it too, as I was doing it in secret.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Only reason I bring that up is, yes, I was Mormon, but in no way when I was engaging in all of that stuff, no way did I feel bad at all. I thought the Mormons were nuts. I'm like, I don't know. This feels to me.
So not my story. I'm just
not going to talk about it, and I'll keep it a secret. But yeah, no shame and guilt on my end, which is sad in a different way. So then why the podcast and why coaching? Why did you feel called to do more with it?
Yeah, I kind of went into recovery about 12 years ago, went to a retreat with a guy who's a therapist who was very accepting, very kind, really what I think religion should be, instead of being rule-based, more relationship-based. And so he kind of introduced me to the basic tenets of what recovery looked like.
Somebody different?
No, it's a different guy. It's a country bumpkin from central Mississippi. So you wouldn't know him. His name's Phil Harden, but shout out to Phil. But Phil's the dad that I've, kind of always wanted. He's not my dad. He's just a good man. But, and so that trickled into, okay, I feel like I'm seeing some progress and growth for myself. How can I help other people? And then it was going, and yeah, you mentioned Jay Stringer. That's how Scott and I met. was doing a training through Jay Stringer, the author of the book Unwanted, and the Journey course online. And so we connected by doing some group training with that and facilitating that. But that story piece that Jay's about, that Phil was also about, was a big part of it. And I really see the podcast as an opportunity to engage people's stories through kindness and curiosity. Really getting people to ask questions about what they're really wanting, where they came from, what their struggle is, instead of just saying, I just want to stop this behavior. The behavior is the problem. I just got to stop it. Once I get that behind me, everything will be great. It's not been my experience. So.
Now, Scott, over to you, man. How the hell did you wind up in this mess? And any unique pieces of your story? You're just another run-of-the-mill sex addict.
Yeah, I was just born a small white sex addict, so that's my story, to steal a line from Steve Martin. But yeah, my story is a little different than Chris's. So I grew up in a typical corporate climber household. My dad was an executive in banking, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom for a long period of time. And we look at family systems in our methodology, the way we approach dealing with addiction is coming from attachment wounds that really date early in our lives, and a lack of attuned caregiving growing up, and a lack of ability to regulate your emotions and form secure attachments because of that early family environment. And so I grew up really feeling, my mom had some trauma growing up in her environment when she was a kid. My dad definitely had some. And so that tends to get passed down through generations in family systems. And I was a recipient of that in my home. So grew up feeling very unwanted, very uncared for. My dad's busy at work. I was very into sports, and I'm not that sporty. I'm more kind of a aesthetically inclined kid instead of athletically inclined at that particular age. And I had an early sexual experience with an older boy who, invited me into a sexual experience that I wasn't prepared for and wasn't expecting. But the environment in my family created kind of the soil in which that invitation really flourished, because I wasn't getting a lot of connection, care, or being seen in my home. But this older boy wanted to see me. Unfortunately, the way he wanted to do it was with some sexual strings attached. So I represent one of about 1/3 of men worldwide who will be sexually abused by their 18th birthday. So I'm that guy. And that really set the stage for me going into puberty. I think somewhat confused about my sexuality because my experience was with another boy. So when I started masturbating and fantasizing it, my mind would drift to my male friends. And shortly after that, I started having some sexual experiences, which is fairly common for boys. When they're entering puberty, they'll jack off together and have oral sex together sometimes. And that was my experience with a lot of different guys. And so for me, this was the norm. And then even when we moved from Kansas City to a small town in Iowa, it was still kind of repeating that same way of kind of finding connection and belonging with other dudes. I started playing football. So I was a typical male, but I've got this secret sexual life that I'm starting to develop. I became a Christian when I was 17 and knew that kind of having sexual experiences with other guys wasn't going to be consistent with kind of my new faith. And so I learned to kind of squash that in the midst of kind of purity culture was emerging in the Christian church at that time. And all became about just stop it, try harder. And so that worked for a long time in my life. I got married. My wife knew my story before we got married, so I wasn't hiding anything. And she loved me, and we started having kids. And I'm an honorary Mormon and Catholic because I had 6 kids. So we did really well at breeding. And my life went along. I was just basically raising my family and building business. I worked in advertising, then I worked in marketing. And things went along with kind of ups and downs in the relationship marriage-wise, but I didn't really struggle sexually until one of my kids started to develop a substance abuse problem. And when we moved to Houston, and that brought a lot of stress and a lot of disruption in my life. At the same time, I had taken a job where I was doing a lot of business travel, spending a lot of time in hotel rooms by myself. And I really cranked up my sexual addiction habit, probably somewhere in my early 40s, later 40s. And that grew over time to the place where I got to the point where I was really ready to cross that flesh line that we talked about and start going back and having experiences with other guys. I felt very alone. I felt really stressed out, and I just was looking for escape. And frankly, I just wanted somebody to hold me at times because I didn't know how to deal with all the shit that was going on in my life. And it got to a point where I almost crossed that line and did it a couple of times and then decided, wow, I need to get some help. Something's really wrong. And I found Patrick Carnes's SAST test, asks you 20 questions, and I scored 17 on it, which clinically you need to be in an inpatient program at 16. And I'm like, whoa, I'm a sex addict. That explains a lot. And so I started treatment with a guy that was very behavioral oriented, using a lot of behavior management techniques, which really fit in line with my kind of religious training upbringing since I was 17. And so that seemed like the thing to do. And again, it worked for a while. And then as my daughter's health kept declining and the stress of an addiction in the family started causing my family to unravel, I got to the point where I just couldn't handle it anymore. And I've been in recovery for 7 years, and I ended up having a major relapse in the year before my daughter actually ended up dying. So huge disruption, major relapse. And that's where I met Chris, and we were training with Jay, which ironically set the stage for me to have to deal with the trauma in my life that had never really been dealt with. And that's what we find is a lot of guys who have been in recovery, if you've been in recovery for several years and you're not making progress, you've got to deal with your childhood trauma. That's usually the source of what's going on. And and a lot of how 12-step programs or kind of the just stop it methodologies work is they're just focused on the symptomology, and they're not really creating first order change, which is really sitting here in our neurobiology, in our identity, in our attachment systems. And so that's where we focus our efforts is. And ironically, the thing that made me a better coach was having a major crash and forcing me to really look at what was driving my behavior in the first place. So that's my story. I'm not a perfect human being, but I'm a human being in process. And I've learned through a lot of this how to be able to sit with myself with that discomfort of not being perfect, with the discomfort of my emotions, and also being in community with other guys who can see me exactly how I am. And I feel known and I feel accepted. So that's my story.
Yeah, you said two things there, and I'd love to dive into the second one. The first one, I just want to reiterate for everybody, you know, these abstinence-based programs, they were designed for substance addiction, and they actually have been shown to work fairly well with that. Process addiction's a totally different beast. Every sex addict is technically different, addicted to something different. And so that's where coming into a room, you know, the other guys there don't have your same addiction, just straight up. It's just how process addiction works. It's just not the same. It's different. And so rather than all sharing this addiction to alcohol, heroin, cocaine, whatever it is, you're not all sharing the same addiction. You are being affected by the same genre. But I like that you mentioned that, Scott, is it's this kind of like stop it approach. To me, I still go to a group locally, but I don't expect it to fix me. I go there to connect with other guys. In no way do I expect, I mean, it's a room full of uneducated sex addicts. So I don't, you know, and it's free. You know, no one's financially vested in protecting the container, you know, diagnosing anyone. I mean, there's no crosstalk allowed. It's literally a place for me to say something, and then all they can say back to me is, thanks, Roland. So, you know, for everybody listening, we're not saying don't go. But just honor what it is. It's a peer support group for you to connect with other guys. And they should not be giving you advice. If they are, it's actually technically against the rules of the 12-step program. And it's supposed to you guys are supposed to work on the 12 steps together. If you read the book, that's the whole point of the group. So I just want to clear that up for everyone. In no way are we saying don't go, but at the same time, also have realistic expectations of what you're getting into.
Roland, but the thing, go ahead, Chris.
I would just say it, you know, everybody's got to start somewhere. I mean,
right.
That's where I started a 12-step group. It didn't work for me. And then I went to something else. So I think you're right to say, listen, you got to start. But I think what I find in any group is the community of people who can see me in a way that I've never been seen before.
Find it and find men who can see you. Because like I said, I think I've been to some groups in like Washington, D.C. and the Bay Area that were amazing. I mean, the guys in there, a bunch of high achieving men, just like me, both into big cars, big homes. I mean, it's, you know, they're my bros. And then I've also been to ones where it's like, there's like almost no sobriety in the room. Their biggest like pain point is their middle manager at their shitty little job. And so I didn't feel seen by them, not because I don't value them as a person. We don't have a common life. And so they just weren't my peers. And so again, I wasn't getting peer support. I was just around people. And so there's a big difference there. What were you saying?
Yeah, that's really wise. I mean, we like to say the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection.
Right.
But to your point, you have to connect with like-minded people. And when I did my initial addiction and life coaching training, the core thing that the therapist who led the training said, there's two things you got to help people do. Most people hate their job or they hate what they're doing in their life. So they don't have a sense of passionate purpose. They just get up and do this stupid job, and they do that for 20 years and they feel aimless and purposeless. So you got to help people find a passion, and you got to help them find their people. Those two things, and they'll get better pretty much on their own. Well, that's what we do, is we help guys kind of discover their passion. You do the same thing and connect to the people that they can relate to. And so that's the critical piece for me. And the core thing there is what you just said is you're not trying to be fixed by anybody. And that's a rule in all of our groups as well, is you're not here to fix anybody, and you're not here to give advice. In fact, don't ever give advice to a man unless he asks for it, number one, or you say, could I tell you what I'm seeing right now? And then you only share what's worked for you, because nobody gives a shit about your theory. If you haven't done it for you, don't bring it to somebody else.
Yeah, good therapists, they'll, before they venture into a road like that, they'll say, they'll ask a overarching question. Have you found that blah, blah, blah? And if they say no, then they don't ask, they don't even go down the other two. Cause it's like, all right, well, if that's something, that you're, and if they say no and they don't ask, why do you ask? They just say no. And that's more of a sign of like, I see where you're going and I don't want to have that discussion. And so, again, for all the other guys out there, I get the desire to want to help people, but you do need to be very, we are talking about mental health. And so all of us need to be very, very careful not to, point somebody down a road that they're not supposed to go. The second thing you said, Scott, which I would love to talk about, and you guys actually have the experience to talk about it. And so I would love to go there. In my groups, it's not uncommon for a straight guy who identifies as straight, meaning his preference is women, but then there will be these acting out behaviors that are with other men. And, some of them are like, well, I don't know, I'm a little curious. So they're not as straight as they think, but some of them are like, no, I'm freaking straight. I know, like I am. And they're not saying that because they don't want to be gay. They just are saying straight up, I'm straight. But I have these acting out tendencies with other men, and sometimes they'll watch gay porn. And, and this obviously brings up more of an issue with the wife. Scott, you had the advantage of being able to disclose this ahead of time. Some guys try to take that shit to the grave. And so when they find the gay porn in the search history or in the, on their phone, and then they come to find out that there's potentially some flesh line in-person experiences with men, that doesn't land as well when it's the first time they're hearing about it. But I would love to speak to this, because this is a huge area of shame. I still wonder, even if in my groups, there's people who have not been completely honest about experiences with the same sex. Can you guys speak to that? Because I know you guys tend to have people gravitate towards your programs who, that is some of the things that's going on with them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say about 50% of the guys that we help have sexual experiences with other guys as kind of a persistent struggle. They may identify as same-sex attracted. And kind of the language around that is just, and we're controversial on this. We don't believe in the straight, bi, gay, binary, or those strict categories.
Neither do I. It's a spectrum.
I think people
sex,
are highly flexible. I think
Mm-hmm.
male sexuality is more socially sexual oriented. We tend to be more adventurous. We tend to be more willing to have sexual random encounters or paid sex, anything like that. So we're focused more on arousal structures that develop in a person's life as the defining of what sexually turns me on versus these categories or orientation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we're coming from, kind of from a holistic perspective. But it is so common for men to have sex with other men that, I don't even know what the percentage of men would if you looked at it. Typically the percentage of the population that identifies as gay and bi is about 5.5% consistently. with older men. With younger men, it tends to be a lot higher because of the socially acceptable nature of it with younger men. But let's say it's 5.5%. I'm pretty convinced that there's about 30% of men at least that have had sexual experiences with other men, at least in middle school, high school, into college, even in their adult years.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things,
I'll go on the record. I don't know about you, Chris, but I had experiences from about age 4 to probably 9 was when it stopped. But it was I had physical sexual encounters with the other boys through
let's
preschool.
66% because I'm the one that didn't have that. So two out of 3, there you go, 66%.
Yeah, and it's really common because boys are very exploratory in nature. We're focused on the outer world. You can hang out with other boys. You can have a boy spend the night. You're not going to have a girlfriend spend the night when you're in middle school. And there's that experimenting. Boys' sex hormones skyrocket by 600% when they enter puberty. And their prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the executive command and control center of our brains, goes fairly offline during the teenage years because of the highly experimental, highly exploratory, very neuroplastic time in life. And so there's a lot of exploring going on with high levels of arousal. So it's not a very uncommon experience. And yet you're right, it does hold a lot of shame because culturally, the one thing we're raised to be as men growing up is never be gay. And so to be aroused in the presence of another man, to get an erection with him, to ejaculate, to have an orgasm, that's something I don't want anybody to know about. And yet it's so common. And so the focus of dismantling that by giving a safe place where other guys can say, what? Me too. And most of these guys that have had these experiences will never identify as gay. They don't see themselves as gay, but it's part of how their arousal structure formed. So that's why we do story work, because it so happens that the only thing that really shapes you are your experiences. There's epigenetics, of course, involved in the transmission of transgenerational trauma. But more than anything else, it's your experiences that shape you. And those early experiences of arousal, whether you're 5 or 9 or 12 or 15, they're going to form a pattern of how you experience arousal in the future until you start to engage them. They're going to operate at a subconscious level in terms of how you begin to experience arousal and connection.
And what we find is that most of the guys who are struggling in this way are looking for masculine connection, whether it's a father wound, whether it's a connection with, they didn't have much attunement and connection when they were young, and they found a peer connection. So that, experimenting with other boys. I mean, I've talked to guys all the time that they're like, oh, well, my parents were really nice and they really took care of me and they told me that they loved me. And yet the only thing that made them come alive was, going out into the woods with some friends and masturbating each other. And,
now, Chris, I got a follow-up question here, because you guys are, Jay for sure, and then from at least what I know of you guys, it's definitely a faith-based program. What percentage of these people are Christian, and then how is that dealt with? Because historically, I know we're kind of in a changing time with some of that, but historically, there's homosexuality and same-sex stuff when combined with Christianity. There's some differing opinions, but then there's some people who it's not differing. It's very black and white. How do you guys navigate that in your program? Being faith-based, being Christian men, coming from Jay's stuff, which, as somebody who I am not Christian, I do not have a particular religious affiliation. But when I see Jay's stuff, to me, it's very Christian, because not being a Christian, when I see it, I smell Christianity from a mile away.
Just go. It smells, do you?
But again, 40%, I would say probably 40 to 50% of the men in my group if you ask them, are you a Christian? I think 40% of them would identify as a Christian. They would say that. Some of them have a really strong faith. But back to the question, what do you guys find in that group? I mean, if half the guys in your group are kind of there for that, how is this discussed from a religious standpoint?
Well, if you go to episode 1 of the We Got Balls podcast, if you can get through the first 2 minutes, then you can be in our groups and you can talk to us, because we via shock value, we throw out all the things you're not supposed to talk about in rigid Christianity, because we would not define, or I'll speak for myself. I don't define myself as a person who sees faith as black and white. It's on a spectrum.
I was going to say,
like
when I read the Bible, and I've read it multiple times, I was forced to in the Mormon church, we have this thing in seminary before high school where I literally study the Bible in a really deep way. Luckily, I bailed. Luckily, that sounds rude. I bailed 2 years in, which was when it converts over to the Mormon books. And so for the first 2 years, it was just all the King James version of the Bible. But my point is, when I read those scriptures, I feel like I'm reading a different book. I hear them say, "Oh, it means this," and I read the book, and I'm like, man, I sure as shit don't see it in there as the way that you're describing it. It's so again. But nonetheless, how do you guys? Do you guys work on some of their religious rigidity? I mean, what do you do to kind of bring sex back into that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a balancing act. Obviously, as Scott and I both have modeled in our stories, there's a lot of curiosity around what is driving you. And so whether it's in your story or because your faith journey is part of your story. So you were raised in an environment that taught you that you were good if you did this or bad if you did this. And so we talk about that and we get curious with guys about that. But the whole thing that we believe that I believe faith teaches explicitly. I'll give you a scripture verse if you want it, or chapter and verse. Romans 2:4. It's the kindness of the Lord that leads us to change. So if you're not embracing kindness, you're kind of fucking up the gospel. So I would say I do stuff like that to push off the rigidity, folks.
Have you read any Richard Rohr's
I love
books?
Richard.
Yeah, I love his outlook. Yeah, because he identifies as a devout Christian.
He's an Orthodox
Christian.
At
the same time, a lot of the Christian community hates his guts, right?
Which is the whole point, is that there is this space in between. And I think, where we hold the middle road, we hold the road between institutional religion, who's trying to promote their own growth and has their rules, and the culture, which is trying to promote its own rules. I mean, we run into a lot of LGBTQ affirming groups who really don't like us because we're not willing to go with their dogma. And we're running into a few Christian people that are just, you people are just heretics, you're going to hell. Sure. Scott, you can answer this as well, because I think this has been a big part of your journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we tend to see the religious side of things as being very control, command, shut it down, just try harder, just stop it. So it goes in line with a lot of those behavior control methodologies. And there's the core word there, control. You're not going to get to a solution by trying to control the symptoms. To Chris's point, the culture seems to handle sexuality with the lowest bar possible, which is as long as there's consent, go ahead and do whatever you want to. And that's a fairly immature way to have a sexual ethic of any kind. Because if you think about it, if you're into prostitution and you go pick up a girl to give you a blowjob, is she really consenting to do that? Because the huge amount of data would show she's been sexually abused as a child, and this is the best she thinks she can do. So she's not really giving you a blowjob because she likes sucking your penis. She's there to make a buck, and don't confuse those two things. So while it looks like you're getting consent, you may not be forcing her to do it. The low bar of consent is maybe she doesn't have any other options. And maybe as decent human beings, we shouldn't be taking advantage of people sexually and objectifying them and treating them like they're a sex toy.
And even pornography, Scott, it's if they're being, the way I look at pornography, if they're being paid, that's slavery. I mean, it just is. That's not.
The term is sex worker, like that correct. Sanctifies it.
I like to call it slavery. Slavery. I take little jabs when I can, and so let's call it what it is. But and then the second piece is okay, let's say they're not getting paid. Let's say that it's, because that's kind of the argument for an OnlyFans type of thing is, but then again, like guys, really, she's setting her phone up and how mentally sound is this individual? And so to me, I wouldn't classify either of those situations as consent. Now, there is the concept of ethical porn, right? Which you guys probably heard of that, right? Where they go through this process of saying, hey, I wasn't paid. That I don't want money. This is literally something I just want to explore my sexuality this way. I like being seen. And I can hear the argument. I can hear the argument there from the people who are like, oh, but there's ethical porn. And then again, my rebuttal to that is, okay, fine. Let's say their mental health sound. They're not being exploited in any sort of way. Then my last question is, okay, you got one box checked, it's two box checked, but there's a third box, and that is what is it doing to your psyche? What are you doing? Because again, you're a person too. And so I think, okay, fine, let's say you get those two box checked on her end. Can you honestly say that by looking at that, you're not devaluing something in you or someone close to you or a value of yours? And again, maybe you can check that box. And if you're listening to this and you're like, no, I can check all three of those boxes. Okay, fine. That's okay. I would say do your due diligence, because I think the compulsive mind just wants to check those boxes off.
That's a very left brain way of justifying a behavior, right? So if I have the rationale for it, but actually you're doing it because of your right brain emotional issue.
Sure.
And the main point on that is, from a neurobiological perspective, even if you're just masturbating to porn, you're conditioning yourself to be a voyeur, a second party participant in a sexual experience rather than an actual participant in a sexual experience. So if anything, it's removing you one step further back from what you actually want to do with your sexuality. I think if you're a healthy person and realize that sexuality is designed to bring a sense of attachment to you and a partner. And the research I was just looking at this morning is there's a direct correlation to people who have insecure attachment styles, either avoidant or ambivalent or anxious attachment, as it's called, and high sexual compulsivity, both homosexual and heterosexual. So it's coming from a place of insecurity in how you form relational connection.
The way I like to say it, Scott, is because again, sometimes people, the word insecurity can be perceived as a threat to people. Here's how I like to word it: it's loaded with an agenda that it's loaded with an agenda from your learned psyche, not from the way I always distort between the two is, would this have happened if I was in a perfect environment, which obviously those don't happen, but if I had perfect parents, perfect leaders in school who are really looking out for everybody's self-actualization and needs and individuality, would I be engaging in this practice? And a lot of the I can't usually pass that test, Scott. I can't pass oftentimes if I really look at what's driving it: money, success, fame, admiration. A lot of it, there's healthy versions of everything that I just said, and then there's also an unhealthy version. And I think it's on you to figure out it's on you to figure out what you're doing. And I think a convenient story is to not dig deep because you found a story that you like and you don't feel like you're doing anything wrong. But again, I challenge guys who think they're there to maybe dig a little bit deeper before you get yourself into trouble, because I did. That was my story. I felt like, I got this thing figured out. This is the best I can do. And I paid the price for it with what I did to my marriage.
Yeah. Well, I think most of your guys are probably fairly avoidant in attachment because they've learned in their
we got one anxious attacher in the whole group. Out of 60 guys, one anxious.
Pretty easy to throw that dart. So why is it the high achievers are so avoidant? Well, because they grew up in a home where they weren't really seen. And so they spend a lot of their life orienting themselves to, look what I can do. Look, you have kids, or don't you, Roland? You have kids?
I do. Yep.
Okay, I got kids. We got kids. Kids want to be seen. Look what I did, Daddy. Look what I made. Look what I made. Celebrate me. See me. And we like to say, Kurt Thompson, Christian psychotherapist that we love to follow, he says, we come into the world looking for somebody looking for us.
Yeah.
And I say, if we don't find them in our home, we go looking outside, and usually we'll look in objects instead of connections with other people. That's what sexual addiction is. I find my sense of connection in an object. Sex is an object. Or I overwork, or I get in risk in high ventures, or I'm a Bitcoin, guy, or whatever. There's a lot of ways that I learned to survive that lack of care and connection in my family system by trying to find this extrinsic sense of worth and value, where really it needs to come from my sense of connectedness to others. And so Patrick Carnes is the one that laid the research on this when he started proposing that sex could be an addiction by doing the research and really figuring out most people that struggle with sexual compulsive or addictive behaviors come from a family system where the failure to bond was the norm. in one of two ways. So what can you do to heal that? Get some bonding, get some connection. So now we're back to where we started.
Well,
and two
this
things
is the through line that runs through it all, from faith to sexuality, is what do you really want?
Sure.
And what Scott is talking about is, as human beings, we really want connection. We really want to be with someone else. And so some of us are not really willing to take that many risks to get it. Some of us are willing to take extraordinary risks to get it. Well, but I got to have it.
And the thing to clear up too, because of my audience listening, every time they hear those two things, it's like, I had great parents and everybody knows me. And so again, that's the problem with childhood trauma and your parents lacking attunement, and then also not being seen, because they're like, oh, I was seen by everybody. I got any girl I want. I was the star quarterback.
Roland, I gotta call bullshit, man. I'm sorry.
But that's their story. But again,
sure.
Here's the challenge with all those things. Good parenting is allowing you to be you. Most parents tell you to be something. So again, let's say you're being seen for the thing they told you to do. Yeah. That if that's not what you want to be seen for, you could be off the charts 10 out of 10 in every category and still feel unseen. That was my case. I was doing everything. I was always the best at everything I've ever done. I've been blessed in that way. And I was completely unseen because I had no interest in being the best in those things, but society told me to do it. And so then I got attention for doing it, but it meant nothing to me. So really look deep inside. Don't look at definitions. Look at how you feel. Look at how you feel. And then second piece, your parents were great. My parents loved the hell out of me. We were poor, but man, they cut coupons. They did whatever they could to give us everything that they could. And, one would look at them and said they were great parents. And I'm not even going to say that they were bad. I'm not going to say that. At the same time, though, did they teach me to discover me? Did they teach me to express me? Did they teach me that the world was a safe place where everyone's not out to get you? Did they teach me, did they teach me the real things that would allow me to grow up to be a functional person? And a lot of guys will die on the cross saying their parents did that. Guys, was your fucking mom like did they had a PhD in psychology and where they practice and if the answer is no, I really doubt they crushed it at teaching you how to discover self, express self, and be safe. And then that last one there of not being seen, parents lacking attunement, but then that other one of I'm connected, look at me, I speak on stage, I'm the CEO of this company. Again, I hear your argument, but read a book about connection and there's trust, there's honesty, there's vulnerability, and there's one other one, safety. And so, you look at all those things and say, oh yeah, I'm vulnerable, I cry. But again, again, read the definition of vulnerability. And it's a lot of these times, the reason I'm bringing this up is these guys will hear these things: childhood trauma, parents lacking attunement, not being seen and connected. And they say, oh, well, I'm not a sex addict then because I crush it in all those categories. I hear your argument, but are you actually crushing it according to the true psychological, biological, scientific definition? Or are you crushing it on the scale of, celebrities online and what your dad said? I mean, they're just two very different things, right?
These guys are trained to perform. And performance is a shame-based mindset. I have to get myself to a place to be enough. Everything you just described
is not enough the way I am today.
Is surface level. All the symptomology, all the circumstances say my parents saw me, they were good people, I can't talk bad about them. But what you're saying is, did they really know me? Did they really understand the true me, or did they put me in a box and say, do this to be loved? And that conditional acceptance by itself works really good for a short period of time. Just like you're finding out, and all of us do, we have a way that the world works best for 20 or 30, maybe 40 years. Maybe you get lucky and you get longer. And if it's not integrated to be both internally validating and externally validating, it falls apart. So,
the story comes to mind of the Google X executive who had his yacht kind of anchored outside in San Francisco harbor. And he hired a prostitute to come out and have sex with him. She came out, she drugged him with heroin, ended up killing him, and sits and finishes her cocktail while he's dying, and then comes over and lifts his wallet out and leaves. And they think she was probably a serial killer. This guy's worth, tens of millions of dollars. He's got 6 kids. He's got everything he wants. He's the head of this Google X project. And yet he still wasn't finding what he really wanted.
Yeah.
And so he's taking something of his life to this place of sexuality where somebody can at least see my desire. And it goes back to the issue of desire. And what you're talking about, Roland, is you can grow up in a home where a child has 2 needs. A child has attachment needs. I need to be attached to others because in the wild, the child can't survive on their own until they're in their teens, right? And so it's a built-in survival instinct that I've got to be attached to my mom and dad. And we all feel that intuitively in our bodies. It's not something you think, it's something you feel. But the second need we have is to be authentic. Because also in the wild, if you don't pay attention to your instinct, your gut, you're going to end up getting eaten for lunch by a tiger. And so you have to pay attention to what you want, your desire, your longings. And when you're in a family system that requires that you compromise your authenticity to stay attached, you're always going to choose attachment over authenticity. And that's what happens to us. So we grow up and we do all this achievement, and then you end up doing things like the Google X executive did, or Robin Williams. Robin Williams at the top of his game ends up dying, choking himself, auto-asphyxiating, I guess. I don't know. But he's worth millions and millions of dollars, and he's not fulfilled. He's not.
Well, and I think the crescendo there is it's not your fault. I mean, our country does this to people. I mean, it just and a lot of countries do this, but we're tied for first of the worst. Yeah. I've been to 97 countries. I besides Japan, and they have a classier way of doing it than we do. We're without question the worst in almost every category. I mean, it's the pressures that this country places on people, and it's getting worse now with, at least when the media was controlled by the news, it was like, all right, let's be somewhat classy. Now, I mean, on the phone, it's completely unregulated. Anyone can say anything they want. And so you got Grant Cardone saying whatever he wants. You got, I mean, any influencer in sales business can come on there and tell you what you need to do. And unfortunately, I think the thing that I see that I really don't appreciate is wealth shaming in the male community works to sell. And so they a lot of them will integrate into their events and their marketing wealth shaming. Basically, you're nothing unless you're one of us. And it works. They'll buy basically whatever you say. If you're nothing until you're one of us, pay $100 a month and join our coaching platform, and we'll teach you how to build wealth. And so that's kind of been and so now it's like, it's been a problem for a while, but it's definitely got really bad in the next 10 years. But my point of all this is play the game, guys. I've got tons of money. I've never had a W-2 or I've never had a tax return smaller than my year previous tax return. I mean, it's just going up and to the right, and I don't plan on stopping because why would I? I know how the game works. So play the game, guys. Play the game. But remember, let's not forget really what we're playing the game for. It's so that you can have resources to build a platform for you to be you. Because I get it. We live this place is expensive. It just is. And you got kids and it's hard. I understand that. It's not having money makes it very difficult here. No doubt about it. It's everything's a lot harder. So play the game. But again, like at a certain point, remember what the game was for. The game was to build you a platform for you to be you. So at a certain point, when you get to that number where you can start kind of shifting the focus towards how do I use these resources as a platform, to me, guys, the day that's there is the day you should do it. I see guys kick the can all the time. Oh, 2 million. Then they get 2 million. 4. And then they get 4. It's like, well, it's really, I need to get honestly closer to 10. 4 is not I thought it was a lot, but it's really not as much as I thought. And so, they just keep kicking the can. And then at a certain point, they're almost afraid. It's like, man, I'm too old now. I should have done it 20 years ago. It's like, bro, you were kicking the can down the road. But I guess that's kind of the topic of discussion is we're talking about two different things, you guys. There's honoring yourself, and then there's crushing it at the way we've chosen to set this country up. And I would say, to me, I don't see anything wrong with getting good at both, but don't get good at one and completely ignore the other. And that goes for capitalism too. Be careful going all in. I've had guys in my program go all in on them, and then they like their wife's like, hey, where's all our money? And it's, and so again, you got to have a fine little balance between the two.
Or you gain the world but forfeit your soul.
Correct. Correct. Which has been said by people for thousands of years, and it's not true. As we wrap up, I want both you guys to give one takeaway piece of advice. So these guys most of my guys are 6 months plus into recovery. They're a lot of them are starting to get a little bored, right? You guys remember at month 6, it starts to feel like a little bit of a washing machine. It's like, all right, I guess we're just going to talk about my lack of connection and childhood trauma forever. So again, when that happens, I get really nervous. What would you guys say to these men in terms of keeping the energy levels really high with this? Because I think boredom and monotony in recovery is a very dangerous place to be. Chris, let's go with you first. What would you say?
Yeah, I think it's what you were just talking about. You got to find out what your purpose is. And if you're not doing this, I like to use the line, what is a man who doesn't make the world a better place? Now, you may see that globally in a big picture, but really, I'm making my family, my community, my connection, my friendship, the space around me a better place. And I think one of the great connections between sexual struggle is purposelessness, is that when I don't have something to go make the world better around me, I'm just going to default to this behavior.
Yeah, futility, they call it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's Viktor Frankl's quote, right? If a man doesn't have purpose, he's stuck with pleasure. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that's what I would say is that, while you can gain the world and we work with guys all over the spectrum economically, from I can't afford to pay my next coaching bill to I'm bringing in, 8 figures. And so but the commonality is there. You've all got to have something to live for, or nothing, or growth is not possible. Mm-hmm. So, for me, that's the thing that I anchor my daily life in, and that I encourage guys to walk in as well.
I like that, Chris. Scott, how about you? How do you keep it interesting?
So I'm going to go back to the companion piece of this, which we've been talking about, is you have to have people. You have to have a community of men around you, in particular, that give you a sense of connection, playfulness. You do things together as a community, you have fun together, and you kind of are open with each other, where it's a safe place to be who you are, to be authentic, to experience that authenticity. The longest longitudinal study on the success, on the thing that makes men happier, has been done at Harvard for over 90 years. And it's not a mystery, right? You probably refer to this in your work. But what is the one thing that makes the difference in happiness in a man's life? Is not the size of his bank account. It's not the hotness of his wife. It's not the kind of car he drives or how many vacation houses. It's the quality of his friendship. Mm-hmm. That is the one thing. So if you want to live a happier life, whether you make 9 figures, 10 figures, it doesn't matter. If you want to live a happier life, you have to have a purpose and you have to have people.
Mm-hmm. I love that, Scott. Yeah, there was a study, you guys probably seen it, and I love it. It's like you can hear a pin drop in a room when you announce this study. But they asked, it was really cool. It was done by Harvard as well. They asked people of all ages who were dying of terminal illness, and they asked them, "Do you wish you had longer?" And it's so funny that it was like 99%, almost everybody they asked said, "No, my life was plenty long. I just wish I did it different." And that I love that, because that was even consistent amongst everybody in their 20s. No, I don't feel like it was really too short. They're like, it was what it was, and it was. I just wasted too much of it, squandered it doing things that didn't align with me. And I love that, because it's like they didn't even want another year. They just regretted how many years they spent out of alignment. And I think that's to anybody who's like wanting to change, that's all they wanted. They didn't even want another day. They just wanted. And so for us, if we have tomorrow, I totally agree with that. If we have tomorrow, take advice from these people. These studies aren't bullshit, and they're not that hard to wrap your head around. why they were here. They are dying. They've come to terms with it, right? They've been, I can't remember the qualifications, but they were, in order to be included in the study, you have had to know you were going to die, I think, for 6 months in advance. And so then they were asking them this, and that data is out there. Listen to it, guys. These aren't fake people. These are real people who lived lives, and in some of these cases died. And that was their answers. Guys, where can they find you? It's Sexcessful Men, sexcessfulmen.com. And then the podcast is We've Got Balls. You guys are on all major platforms.
We're on major platforms, YouTube, We Got Balls.
You guys have lives on YouTube. I like
WE Got Balls. And ignore the basketball podcast. That's an old podcast. Don't worry about that one. We're just the real, raw, masculine sex talk podcast.
Hey, I love it, guys. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Roland.
Thank you, Roland.